We're now joined by Hana from the School of Economics at UCT and Frank Chaloupka from the University of Illinois to discuss issues around taxation of tobacco. Hana and Frank, thank you very much for joining us this morning. And I'm going to start with you, first of all, just with why tobacco taxation is such a powerful tool, or is it?
Yes, it's the most effective tobacco control policy. It is effective because people respond to higher prices of tobacco products. So in the way we can increase these prices is increase tobacco taxes. And we know from the law of supply and demand, and once there is an increase in price, people reduce their consumption. So, and we have had studies done in many countries that empirically demonstrate this relationship. So we know it works, and it works universally all over the world.
Frank, which countries have done it well, and how can tobacco tax have a direct impact on public funding?
Well, I think we see a number of good examples of where it's been done really well, but when you start to think about the impact on public funding, I think the Philippines is probably the best recent example. So the Philippines used to have a very complicated tax system, used to have very low taxes on some of the brands that were most consumed, and then decided a few years ago, back in 2012, to reform their tax system. And what they did was to unify their system, bring all the taxes to the same level across all brands, raise the taxes significantly, and then at the same time take 85% of the new revenues that they got from the tax and put it into a program to support universal health care, which has really provided access to health care for low-income families in the Philippines.
What are some of the big challenges, or why do so many countries not get it right?
Because the tobacco industry tries to convince them that if they raise their taxes, a lot of bad things are going to happen, and they're usually focusing on economic arguments. They talk about if you raise taxes, you're going to have a lot of illicit trade, you're going to put people out of work in the tobacco sector, and that's going to have multiplier effects through the economy. They talk about how it's going to be harmful to the poor, and in the end it's not going to generate the sort of public health impact, the revenue impact that we talk about. But again, as Hana talked about, we have experiences all around the world that show that when governments raise their taxes, none of the bad things the industry says are going to happen, that you actually see increases in employment, you see increases in economic activity. Illicit trade doesn't explode, they generate revenues, and they reduce tobacco use.
Hana, do you want to weigh in there on some of your experiences on which countries have done it right and the challenges?
Yeah, no, certainly there we have good examples, like Frank said, in the Philippines. I'd like to just point out with what's happening here in South Africa, because South Africa was a really good example of how tax policy works beautifully. It has been increasing taxes, pricings have been increasing, consumption went down substantially, but it sort of has stopped around 2010. Since 2010, there was very small increases in tobacco taxes, usually eroded by inflation, and we can see that very clearly in the data that consumption plateaued, prevalence plateaued. So I think South Africa really should go back to the same pattern where it was, and should again be an example for Africa how to do this policy right.
Frank, what are some of the counter-arguments against tobacco taxation, and are they warranted?
So again, it comes down to a lot of economic arguments. The industry argues that if you raise taxes and reduce tobacco use, that's going to cause job losses in the tobacco sector, and then they talk about how that's going to ripple through the economy, that people involved in distributing tobacco products are going to lose their jobs, retailers are going to lose their jobs or go out of business. The incomes that people generate from tobacco, they're not going to be earning, so they're not going to be buying other goods and services, and that's going to put people out of work as well. The illicit trade argument is, I think, the one that gets used the most widely and is probably the most effective, and that's partly because it's very difficult to measure illicit trade. Hana's been doing a lot of work on trying to define how to do that, and has been doing it in many countries.
And a final question for you, what would be your advice for governments in how to make tobacco tax work for them, considering they all operate very differently?
Yes, we have a lot of different tax systems in the world, and what I've been talking here at the conference a lot about is that it's important to make tobacco tax system simple, because the complex tax system leads to a lot of different loopholes, and then it's difficult for government to also administer such a taxation under this complex tax system. So try to simplify the system and increase the tax. So the two things, but before the tax increases, it's important to have the tax system in place so that the tax increase, when it's there, is actually affecting the tobacco prices, tobacco product prices.
All right, Hana, Frank, thank you very much for your insight.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.